The land of Britain was once considered a myth by the mighty Roman Empire. To them, it was nothing more than an old legend. This would change in the year 55 BC, when Julius Caesar set his sights on this fabled island and sailed towards its shores. The historical discovery would end in music. Defeat. Almost a century later, the Romans found glory when Roman Emperor Claudius stepped foot on British. They set their eyes on Stonehenge, using the sacred site for their worship and rituals. Londinium was established, and the Romans seized control of the land. But what happened next in the history of the United Kingdom? To understand this fascinating land, we must start from the very beginning: music. What would become the United Kingdom began way back within the prehistoric Paleolithic period, which dates back to 950,000 years ago, a time that the earliest evidence of an ancient civilization dates back to the first settlers that arrived in Britain were hunter-gatherers who traveled from Europe around 8,000 BC and are now known as the first music Britons. This group of people showed one of the earliest forms of economy, with the hunters trading native elk, wild cattle, and pigs, while defending themselves from wolves and bears, which were rife in Britain at that time. Over the years, people have discovered a large quantity of tools, such as carved stone edges and hand axes. It is incredibly rare to find human remains from this period, which has made it difficult for experts to determine which form of hominids were living there at any particular time. With that being said, the tools that have been found give evidence that they were probably a subgroup of Homo erectus, like a species known as Homo heidelbergensis. Trying to follow the movements of the Homo erectus is also very difficult, with the early sites that have been discovered being divided by many years spread out around Europe, making pattern forming difficult. At one time, Britain was part of the European mainland, and not the island we know. Today this made it incredibly easy for groups to spread and relocate to other parts of the landmass. As the land moved and water levels rose, groups were cut off and were left to evolve. These early inhabitants relied heavily on both hunting and scavenging, which have been proven by the wooden spears discovered in Essex, which are believed to have been crafted around 450,000 years ago. It is often the stone tools that survive, so finding wooden remains is an incredibly rare and valuable find in terms of the information they provide. The hand axes would often get worn down over the years, with flint flakes chipping off them. It is these flakes that give archaeologists a trove of information, especially when they can trace the technique of making them, the complexity of the tool, and the type of stone used. In fact, hand axes were not used to chop down wood, but were more likely a way of cutting up animal carcasses for eating, because of the simplicity of the tool and the expertise of the hunters. After creating several of them, they've been discovered in high volume at some ancient sites. This proves that groups often return to certain places, and that they chose not to carry the tools with them as they traveled, instead making new ones on arrival. As the techniques in tool-making advanced, the Neanderthals of Britain began strategizing with their weapons to hunt larger prey, like woolly rhinos or mammoths, that once called Britain their home. The next phase in the prehistoric period is known as the Upper Paleolithic era, which saw humans physically evolve into what we are today, with only a few elements of our ancient ancestors still surviving in one form or another. This is why we still have wisdom teeth, which were once crucial for eating raw food. At this time, Europe would have been an incredibly harsh and cold place to live, as a result of the last ice age. This led to many inhabitants leaving at certain times when the climate dropped to ensure their survival. This was not only to prevent freezing to death, but to ensure that they were able to find plenty of vegetation and animal prey all year round. Limestone gorges also offered shelter to people living in Britain around this time, with deep caves and overhangs being invaluable places to set up camp around 11,300 years ago. Britain began to warm up, which began a substantial phase of growth, which saw birch and pine trees flourish, as well as other forms of greenery. Other forms of woodland also spread across the land, including oak, hazel, lime, and elm, which are still in abundance to this day. Particular animals that remained after the colder climate changed, such as reindeer and horses, drawing hunters that were accustomed to tracking and killing the animals. This led to many of them traveling across Europe and settling in Britain. As the climate continued to warm up, many of the inhabitants had to change their prey to red deep deer and boar, as other animal species migrated or died out. This change of prey forced humans to evolve their tools and technology in order to survive around 6,300 years ago. During the Mesolithic period, many groups began setting up winter and summer camps, which allowed them to live in an ideal environment that catered to their needs when the natural climate changed through the seasons. Sticking to one place would use up all their food and resources, such as wood for making fires. Without these things, they would perish. Spending time in another location meant that the local habitat could repopulate again, which humans could hunt once they returned. Coastal sites were often chosen for certain times of the year, which meant that humans began eating a heavy sea-based diet, which mostly consisted of fish and mollusk. This also helped develop tools that could be used to help catch water-based prey, further expanding their knowledge and curiosity about the ocean. The transition from hunting and gathering came about around 4100 BC, which was aided by the arrival of agricultural techniques that came nothing from the east. This was propelled by the population boom seen during the late Mesolithic period, which meant that the animal resources they previously relied on were depleting fast. The British landscape began to change soon after, with the inhabitants making mass flint tools, which were equipped with wooden handles. These were used to clear the land so that fields, pastures, and settlements could be created. Barley and emmer were the first main crops grown for a vegetative food source, while pigs and cattle were captured and bred so that they could generate their food. Own meat sources rather than kill them straight away for food. This shift to building a self-efficient settlement saw the first domestic buildings, which included large, narrow wooden buildings known as longhouses. Another form of domestic building was structures for the dead to be stored and respected, known as long barrows. The Neolithic period introduced several huge changes to Britain, especially when it came to technology, landscape, and settlements. The K-way enclosure became popular at this time, which were circular monuments built up banks and ditches, forming a ring around the settlement. Structures, known as curses, were often built within the circular banks, with the longest enclosure ever discovered in Britain measuring an incredible 10 kilometers, which is around 33,000 feet. When it came to hunting, the way that settlers created arrowheads evolved, with the design appearing more like a leaf shape to aid its aerodynamics. These later changed to chisel and transverse arrowheads to further improve their craft. This was a result of social changes, which were no doubt influenced by different groups mixing that shared their crafting expertise. The chisel arrowhead was easier to use, which could be glued or bound to an arrow shaft, which made production far quicker. During the middle of the Neolithic period, the British settlers began to slow down when it came to wild animal hunting, instead depending on their own livestock afterward. Arrowheads became less sharpened as they were used as a deterrent against other settlements stealing livestock rather than killing the thief. The reason for this could have been down to rising social pressures that forbid murder as a punishment for any injustice. Between 2600 and 2200 BC, monuments known as henges were erected, one of which being the famous Stonehenge, found in Wiltshire, England. While there is no definitive proof, it is believed that the henges were used for rituals and astronomical observation, because the ditches are located inside of the banks. Experts have concluded that it wasn't used as a form of defense, but rather as a symbol of defense. During the later Neolithic period, pottery and tools began to change. During the early Neolithic era, pottery was often round-bottom bowls with necks that slopped down. By the late Neolithic, the style changed to flat-based pots that were decorated by etches made during the drying process. These early pots were primarily used to brew and store beer, although dairy products and stews were also contained in them, with groups gathering and technology quickly advancing for the prehistoric people of Britain. It was time to move into the next critical era for their advancement, the Bronze Age. The arrival of metal and beaker-style pots represents the change in Britain, ushering in the Bronze Age of the country that began in 2200 BC. Bronze alloy was actually much rarer than iron ore, which meant that the resource was reserved for tools. White gold was primarily used to create jewelry. The other alloy used by people during the Bronze Age was tin, which was also quite scarce in Europe. Because bronze can be cast at a much lower temperature than copper, it meant that bronze casters could use molds to create more elaborate designs, such as daggers, H-birds, and axes, which were far more durable than the stone tools that came before them. Bronze is also much harder than copper, as the tin within it reinforces it on an atomic level beaker. Pots were still used after bronze was utilized, with their different designs, decorations, and refinements improving as time went on. In fact, intact beakers and pots that were used in the burials give an insight into the craftsmanship, which sometimes still has honey residue in them from the beer they drank. Daggers were made longer during the middle of the Bronze Age, which became the first swords made in Britain, which were called rapiers, as social tensions grew between the different groups of people. More variations of weapons and shields were made. There is even evidence that neighboring settlements could have used the weapons heavily by the damage sustained to them, although they could have been intentionally damaged before being placed in hoards to prevent anyone else from using the swords against them. While there is evidence of human remains being cremated in the Bronze Age, it's likely that much of the remains were scattered or placed in moving water. This is evident from the lack of bones found within burial sites where more bodies should have been located. This shows how the people of this time mastered fire and ways of increasing its heat to successfully burn human remains and cast metal. It was during the Bronze Age that boundaries around land started appearing, which were traded and claimed by dominant families. Livestock pens and agricultural fields became an important part of everyday life, as well as the copper mines that provided jobs for inhabitants and allowed metal work to advance at a very swift pace. A historically important site was discovered at Great Orme Inland. Did know whales that provided 90% of the ore used to create axes all around the northwest of Europe from 1000 BC. Another change in climate resulted in many areas of Britain becoming uninhabitable, mostly due to the lack of crop growth in the cold conditions. Also, areas that were once ideal for growing vegetation became wet and boggy, with the eruption of the Hekla volcano and Iceland blocking out much of the sunlight, with the land becoming inhospitable. Many settlers moved on from the land, while others repurposed the fields for strictly raising livestock. Those who refused to leave were forced to build walkways and raised settlements over the wetland beneath, which inadvertently improved their structure building skills. The most preserved examples of cloth, food, contained in pots, tools, furniture, and wooden objects were discovered within the below these settlements, as they would have dropped down or fell in after a structure was attacked.